feature of organisational doctrine. Channel 4 catalysed an explosion of independent programming, which was in many cases instigated by a creative who, on receiving a commission, would then crew up, which included a production manager there, solely to funnel the budget onto the screen. The BBC Producer Choice Initiative in the 1990s made producers responsible for budgets, but one implication of this was that the perception of production as low in the television hierarchy was reinforced, because producers, most often men, made the choice. So this perception lingers. So Perelandra will now speak to how to address this undervalue.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, how do we address the undervaluing of production managers? At the beginning of distinction, Borjo considers the role social dimensions play in the division between what he terms worked upon objects and art. And he asks, at what point does society invest in activity or an object with high status? Arguably, the function of PMs, production managers, plays a part in the value that's assigned to it. PM tasks are very much the worked upon objects, the tools that make the art, not works of art on their own merits. So when viewed this way, PM is a function of doing activity, not form and knowing activity. And it therefore lacks the status that would encourage higher pay, better working conditions, and a perceived desirability, which is always alluded to the role. The broadcast article on the Bournemouth University Production Management Survey finds that PMs wish there was more awareness of how many hours are being worked outside the typical 9 to 5 office hours. And this tallies with my experience. The work of the PM is often invisible. It's only really noticed when things go wrong. When working at companies, including the BBC, ITV, Sony Pictures in the late 90s through to the mid 2000s, I can remember the many ways in which the role was often kind of subjected to a reductive stereotype of a little woman doing womanly activities or twiddling with Excel sheets, as I heard one colleague describe it. Other tropes included the dragon sitting on the production gold, refusing to allow creative spend, or the headmistress wheeled out to give the crew a talking to if they were being naughty boys. Ironically, in an environment where motherhood was largely deemed a bit of an inconvenience, the role of crew mother was also favoured, notably when a softer touch was considered appropriate for crew problems. And none of these kind of patriarchal cosplays allowed for the real PM distinctiveness to emerge. As a profession, production management is a really intriguing discipline to examine. Much of the work occurs in a really conventional office, not dissimilar to any other. But meanwhile, filming, editing, sound recordings take place in environments set up to support what Grenfell called a distinctive logic of practice. There are sound desks rather than tables, TV monitors instead of notice boards. The tools of the editorial team are big, shiny, expensive. The PM's apparatus is often just a laptop and a notebook. Stern describes technologies as little crystallised parts of habitus, the use of which creates memorable social, cultural and material processes. And this would certainly be said to be true of TV production. The contrast of the office setting, which is conventionally associated with secretarial work and people pushing, compared to the dynamic studio or filming location, acts as a motif of administration rather than creativity, because obviously administration can't be creative. And while the work of a PM requires a huge amount of mental agility and what Sean referred to as reflection in action, it's rarely acknowledged as being as innovative as other production roles. And yet, before we get too conclusive, it's worth looking at some of the data from the Bournemouth project, which both kind of problematises the above line of history, but also presents a suggestion for renewing a new way of working. So this is a quote from a PM who started, and I think we've got a slide. We've spent a lot of time getting this slide, so let's get the slide. There we go. So this was the PM who started working in the 80s. And she says, during my early career, there was never any split. We were in editorial meetings, we worked alongside writers in my offices. Everything was incredibly together. So, you know, a writer would sit on a meeting with the designer, with me, with the director. It was just a big melting pot of ideas, and everybody was valued quite equally. I think, and everyone had a really good understanding that production managers were there to facilitate their dreams. Therefore, there was a really good communication between line producers, PMs, and editorial. I mean, I used to work with two writers sitting next to me all the time, and they'd go, "Can we afford 5 sheep?" And I would say, "Make it 3 and we'll do it." It's really interesting to note that this anecdote, which recalls the 80s, which is a period of time which held many challenges for women in the workforce, offers an example of how at one time the PM was treated as a member of what they were called a community of practice. They were valued equally as a collaborator. Why this has changed is unclear. Certainly, as shrinking production budgets struggle to keep up with streaming appetites, PMs are more likely to be viewed as dream killers than facilitators. The usually female face of unpopular budgetary decisions, which are actually largely decided by men. Coupled with work models that don't favour caregivers, it is work which is not only undervalued, but is in many ways undesirable. And yet, demand has never been higher. There is simply, as Rowan said at the beginning, not enough PMs to fill the requirement. Over the last decade, the shortage of production managers have seen broadcasters such as the BBC create departments whose sole responsibilities are to work with higher education institutions to recruit trainee PMs. Production management staff find themselves in a unique position. They're highly employable, and yet they're denied the accolades and high salaries offered to editorial staff. And this is a positioning which creates a really muddled identity for the role. They're recognised as essential, yet denied professional credit and pay. And arguably, this paradox has been partly created, I believe, by a lack of understanding of how complex the PM skill set needs to be. And what's often missed in discussions about production management is how the role demands what the crews called a heightened reflexivity. You know, when a crisis hits a filming shoot, PMs have to very swiftly draw on their practice knowledge, constructing a new approach, reflecting on what has led to an issue, and creating solutions which don't impact the fragile balance of time, budget, and editorial vision. Sean referred to this as a reframing, and he argued for a recognition of the knowing in practice, which is evident in the activities of practitioners. And it's an argument, he said this in 1994, but it's an argument that several decades later still needs to be made for the work of the PM. An acknowledgement of the knowing in practice, without which, as Elka stated beautifully at the beginning, productions could simply not be made. So how can this acknowledgement happen? What can be done to change these perceptions of value? I think the inclusion of the discipline in further research, such as this, is a start. The closure of pay gaps between other senior members of production teams is also long overdue, as is the need for production companies to actively engage with recommendations to offer flexible working and shorter filming days, which have been made by recent reports, Time-Wise, Back2 Vision. And finally, while production is an industry that is forever looking forward, a move back to the workflows described earlier, which saw production management teams in the 80s working side by side with editorial staff, equal in every sense of the word, would encourage meaningful activity. Thank you.
So our, sorry, what am I doing? What am I doing? So our next two speakers, again, apologies, Luca, Barra, who
We are
is
not
here.
doing the other Luca, actually.
Yes, that would be useful, wouldn't it? Quite
Yeah.
That's the one, yeah, there we go.
Oh,
So,
that should work. Nice.
We've got Luca and Luca. Luca Antoniazzi at the University of Pollenzo and Luca Barra at the University of Bologna, and you are reporting back from a project you're working on at the moment, aren't you? So, yeah.
Exactly. So, good morning to everyone. I hope Luca is hearing me as well at a distance. Thank you. Thank you very much for to the organizers, and thanks to everyone here and online as well. Also for allowing this kind of hybrid presentation. I'm Luca Barra, and Luca Antoniazzi will be connected online. So as Elke was mentioning, we can go to the subsequent slide. Thanks. We are presenting here a portion of the results of a big research project that's going towards the end after 3 years and a half of research. It was a bit disrupted by COVID and by several other stuff along the way. But we are kind of going towards the end in 6 months or so. As you have seen, the project is called Factor, with a small word play. The complete title is Forms of Contemporary Media Professional Acting, Training, Recruitment and Management, Social Discourses from 2000 to 2020. And it's focused especially on Italian audiovisual industry, on Italian screen industry. So we are looking at actors and intermediaries there. We have several research units. It's 4 Italian universities going together in this research with different expertise. The University of Udine, the University of Turin, the University of Rome La Sapienza, and the University of Bologna. Now Luca has gotten a better position elsewhere, but he has worked for several years in Bologna together with me and our research team. The Bologna unit is mainly focused on television and whatever is not film, actually, in looking at actors, actresses, and intermediaries, and adopts a mainly production cultures approach, more or less, that will be visible from the things that we will say. Inside our units, we are kind of following, of course, tied to the Italian scenario, to the Italian environment, these 3 main research questions. So first of all, what is the role of television, whatever television means now, of course, in contemporary acting careers? So how it has changed, how it is changing in its recognition, for instance, that's becoming more and more visible, in its creative role, in its economic role inside actors and actresses' careers. A second research question is kind of try to map, to do a typology of the main forms of television acting, television performance, which is very, very varied. There are many typologies, many spaces, many roles. We are looking at scripted television shows, of course, but also to unscripted, where actors play a different role and stuff like that. And the third research question we have followed in these 3 years and more, which intermediaries are shaping the TV actors and actresses' careers and how they are working. So we are looking at commissioners, at producers, at the management professionals, and so on. In this context, in this conference, in this panel, looking at outsiders, as it was said before, we kind of focused on a portion of the research, looking at some sorts of hidden figures, of transparent figures, but not neutral one, actually figures of power, figures of compromise, as the talent agents and the talent agencies. So we looked at that. We focused on the relationship between the actors and actresses and talent agencies, and also between talent agencies and the rest of the screen industry. But I'm giving the floor to Luca for some.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for having me, for having us, of course. I'm going to read, so it's going to be, I'm going to stick to the schedule. So to answer the questions that Luca just presented to you, we decided to use interviews to access what we perceived as a very small and close network of professionals, agents, managers. Interviews, in fact, allow to investigate the processes of causation that might explain social phenomena at the micro level, but they are also useful to answer exploratory research questions, so to investigate unknown territories. As far as we know, this is the first research carried out on Italian talent industry. As initial recruitment strategy, we simply decided to email agents describing our project and the reasons we wanted to involve them. Unfortunately, that was not a fruitful strategy, as although we recruited 2 or 3 participants via emails, most of our messages went unanswered. Phone calls reveal much more effective through a productive phone call with a coordinator of the industry association, LARA, which stands for roughly Free Association of Artist Agents. We could ignite the snowballing process we were looking for and access several important Italian agents / managers. In the Italian context, the 2 terms are in fact equivalent. We will be using them interchangeably. We talked with about roughly 11 agents, formally interviewed 9 of them, and reached saturation between the 7th and the 8th interview, about an hour long in length. We provided information via email and used semi-structured questionnaire checklists. We provided the option to carry out the interview either online or in person, face-to-face. In fact, we found convincing the arguments put forward by the scholars who consider online digitally mediated interviewing as reliable. See, for instance, Jessica Sullivan, Valeria Loiacono, etc. Most of interviews were conducted via Zoom, as agents overwhelmingly prefer to meet virtually. Especially after COVID, it seems that people feel more at ease with online communication than in the past. So next slide, please. So what did we find out? The premise to this set of findings is that the talent industry does not look like an industry at all. It is extremely fragmented, and it includes small businesses, micro businesses, often family-run businesses, which translates into this spread of a highly non-standardized set of business practices. Thus, it is very different, of course, from what Violain Roussel called the big Hollywood agency, so Creative Artist Agency, United Talent Agency. But it's also different from small Hollywood, in that Italian agency do manage national stars and do work with both television and the film industry. But the Italian system seems to be different from the French system too, where, according to the Filmaudier, a neat division between small and big players is present as in the US. That said, in Italy, as elsewhere, agenting, and I quote William and Denise Bilby here, quote, is a brokerage system in which brokers establish reputations through repeated successes in matching artists to commercial projects. This conceptualization provides an efficiency-based explanation for the role of talent agencies. The brokerage activities allow markets to clear in a business context surrounded by ambiguity, risk, and uncertainty, end quote. In Italy, however, agents, to different extent, are also managers. So they are part of the construction of the professional identity of their clients. So they help them with choosing projects, with managing social media and communication. They help them to keep calm during long periods of unemployment. Agents share reputational capital with their clients, even with established actors. One participant said to us, I represent my clients, but they also represent my agency. And here, it's clear how the 2 parties' interests are kind of aligned in this process. However, agents' behavior change in relation to the typology of client they represent. There seem to be 4 typologies. Those who just came out from acting school and hope for secondary roles, the beginners. Those who have substantial experience in secondary roles, but are not in the position of selecting too much what is offered to them. They recognize actors. And third group, established actor that can and should select the roles, yearn for protagonist roles, and to define their professional identity. Those are established or renowned actors. The 4th group includes, of course, the stars. As far as young and non-established actors are concerned, the relationship based on trust between agent and casting director is fundamental. Luca will talk about this in detail later on. Trust is associated with talent as well as professionalism. punctuality, humility, flexibility, and in general terms, actors' willingness to follow the industry modus operandi, the habitus, unwritten rules. This is what some of the agents seem to refer when they talk about professionalism. As far as more experienced actors are concerned, even stars, the reputation of the agency is important as it can protect actors from failures and help them when their career seems to decline due to commercial catastrophes, personal difficulties, mistakes, or misbehavior. So you have promotion and protection at the same time. Agents get industry inside infos before it gets public and play proactively. So these pieces of information are simply inaccessible to most actors, but they're very important today as the industry is increasingly competitive, challenging, and runs very fast. Agents all know each other, and they know major casting director and some major producers. They meet them formally and informally on a regular basis. So sometimes agents put forward some of their clients informally or simply show interest for a given project that is about to be funded or is about to start, but it's not, details are unknown to most people in the industry. So this is something very important for actors. Agents are also industry and legal expert, or they should be, and share this expertise with their client. Their role is increasingly important for actors to navigate the complex details of contracts and the implication that these details might have on their careers. Negotiation, as Luca will detail later on, concerning economic compensation, actor names, visibility, and as far as TV series are concerned, options for future seasons and social media communication. So these are very complicated issues to deal with, even for established actors, and agents are fundamental to make rational decisions. One important issue here is to guide actors to put boundaries on what is acceptable and what is not. Often agents have a sense of what other agency or other actors are doing and how they are behaving. So this is very important. So they have a sense of where the industry is going. So being part of the industry association is very important because you have a sense of what are the trends there. And this technical and industry knowledge, it's fundamental to guide actors in making decisions. Fourth, agents establish emotional ties with their clients. Most agents confirm results coming from previous research on the vulnerability of actors' well-being. Agents have a role in guiding actors to keep stress under control. Actors are constantly subject to judgment by casting directors, by audience, by critics. Their economic and personal life is extremely unstable, so that even established actors cannot plan their lives for longer than 2 years. And even if they know they might get a job after 2 years, they don't know what kind of job. They might be obliged to accept something they don't like or that put their professional identity at threat. So that's years of work. Women tend to be paid less and also tend to have different career paths, usually shorter. And for example, especially around 35, 40 years of age, agents said to us that a lot of women careers face a difficult conjuncture, and that put a lot of stress and anxiety on them. In summary, some of the clients, agents do play a significant role in avoiding too impulsive decision making and to govern strong emotions, both positive emotions like excitement and negative emotions such as depression. Okay, I think my part is finished. Luca, if you want to take over.
Yeah. Luca explained to us the relationship between talent manager, agents, and actors and actresses. Another thing we looked at is how agents are dealing with the production system. So the other part of this mediatory role. And here we are putting together several points, and so first we can say that talent agencies are representing actors and actresses, but also many other players in the market: directors, screenwriters, composers, director of photography, even writers. And this is also a trick, a way to forecast, to anticipate what's going on in the industry. As one of our interviews said, it's an eye on the future, so we are anticipating what will be the acting needs in the future. There is a strong relationship always present with the casting director, and through them with directors. This is the more direct connection. What's going on, which actors are looked for or will be looked for. There are cast lists that have to be answered, and there's a very important gatekeeping function on both sides in order to optimize everyone's work. As Luca was already anticipating, trust here is key, the loyalty, the credibility, the guarantee, even complicity, a work friendship, collaboration and interconnection, I'm quoting. You plant seeds, you find the right match between everyone's needs. Everybody knows each other in this small industry and will remember previous behavior, and that's important. Productions, I'm quoting again, are always afraid. They have a very long-term memory, so you cannot make mistake, you cannot try to exert in unfaithful way this kind of power and this kind of relationship. This is one connection. Another connection is the one with television producer, which is only sometimes, not always, with a more proactive approach. They are looking for projects and scripts. They are thinking about project tailored on an agency actors. Producers are the ones who are actually writing down the contracts, and then these first drafts are discussed and reworked and defined with the talent agency, with the talent agents. There are money discussion, there's discussion on the exact days on set, there's the right to first call, of course there's exclusivity factor, where to put the name in the credits, end credits, and also first credits, and very trivial things like on-set accommodation, travels, hotel, cars, trains, apartments, and stuff like that, all defined with the detail in the contracts. There are specificity for television series, the option for the following seasons, of course, but also the fact that if compared to cinema, you are not looking at a complete script, but only partial portions. So it's kind of a blind choice. And once again, fate and trust are becoming even more important. And this is the negotiation, of course, depending on the actors and the options available. Sometimes producers are looking for specific actors, and of course, this gives the talent agents a lot of space for negotiation. Some other times they are just wanting to fill some slots, and so if you are not accepting the condition, they will move to another actor. A third relationship is the one with commissioners. Often these kind of relationships are very indirect with free-to-air broadcasters, with premium channels, with digital platforms. But here there is something that needs to be stressed once again, the fact that platforms are changing the rules and are changing, also exerting their strong and once again hidden almost apparently transparent power. So there is a standardization of the contracts. There's a reduction of the possible exceptions when dealing with Netflix or other platforms. As one of the interviews said, platforms has given stability to the whole system, but they have also eliminated most of the exceptions in the contract of many actors and actresses. There is the right to control the set photos or the credits benefits that it's given away, or at least the platforms want to keep that kind of right. The options for the subsequent seasons in a TV series are already included in the first contract, and of course this leaves out lots of power for the agents and for the actors if the series is successful, because you are already forced to go on with the subsequent seasons. There's the obligation for actors to use their personal and social media account for promotion of the title, which was not there before, and now it is in the contract as well. If you like it, well, otherwise it will be someone else's turn, I'm quoting again. And then there is the relationship with other intermediaries, press offices, PR managers, digital agencies, social media managers, and so on. So as you've seen, a very rich and complex networks of relationships and negotiations and power struggles. Let's go to the next slide, which is the final one, also to just highlight some of the conclusion, or maybe further trajectories of our research. We started looking for television specificities. We had, as a result, the fact that the old classic distinction between film and television that was there some decades ago is now more or less surpassed. These boundaries have been blurred. These boundaries have been substituted by others. The real boundary is between legacy media and digital platforms in the way they are operating. And if you are thinking about the ways they are using actors and actresses, the real cleavage is between audiovisual, oeuvre, and entertainment. And so there is this increasing role of social media metrics, especially with young actors and actresses, in looking at influencers, TikTokers, and other kinds of figures doing acting roles, stealing acting jobs. Last 2 points. Television teen dramas have been very important in digital platforms, but also in free-to-air television, to make a change of perspective in the industry. I'm quoting one of our interviewees. Finally, my clients, young actors and actresses, were no longer the son coming back from school and telling just a couple lines to his mother, but had its own story to be told. And this had changed completely the market for younger actors and actresses with an unprecedented attention and a set of opportunities. And this allowed space also for the diversity factor, which was pushed a lot by digital platforms, but also public service broadcaster. To go back to one of the things that Luca said at the beginning of his portion of the speech, we kind of are in a field that's not an industry, but it's undergoing a very, very slow process of industrialization, starting from an artisanship that has lasted decades. We are not there yet, but of course there is this sense of losing the personal connections while gaining a standardizations. The bar of talent has been raised. I'm quoting again. Now the need is to play on a global scale. The talent agency is not an employment office, but a partner to work with to shape the careers. And in this kind of connections towards a future industrialization, TV is getting a crucial, often central role. TV in its larger way, including, of course, Netflix and the digital platforms, both for each performer's career and the system as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm sort of freestyling over some slides, so I hope I can keep this effectively paced. So, a little. Are you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, right. So I'll signal to you.
We went to.
Fantastic. So the background of this paper, I've been studying kind of adaptations of John le Carré for some time, and particularly I keep coming back to the 1979 version of Tinker Tailor's Soldier Spy. And a couple of years ago, I was invited to contribute an essay to this edited collection all about Tinker Tailor's Soldier Spy. And here I was investigating a large collection of kind of exciting sort of showbiz anecdotes and surrounded the production of the 1979 adaptation that surface in the biographies of various people and various popular histories. And I was kind of arguing that the source for a lot of these stories is John le Carré himself. He is the kind of the master storyteller who's basically turned the making of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy into another one of his stories. That's what I did in the book. So that's kind of the meta-narrative. What I wanted to do for this conference paper, this got me thinking about what exactly was John le Carré doing on the set of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy? Why does he claim to know so much about what happened during its production? For, as we will see, he had no credited role. Okay, next. So John le Carré first, so I'm going to do a bit of the backstory here. John le Carré first comes to prominence in 1963, 1964, when his third novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, becomes this huge international publishing phenomenon. He's actually the pseudonym of David Cornwell. I've decided that's important to specify right up front because I'm actually going to be quoting from some documentation that calls him le Carré and some documentation that calls him David and/or Cornwell. So just for the record, this is the same person, and it might get a little confusing. So le Carré's first brush with screen media comes when a film is made of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and he manages to get himself and interestingly, an uncredited advisory role, which becomes a bit of his trademark here. And he is not the person who adapts the novel as a screenplay. However, the director, Martin Ritt, brings him on board and lets him do a little bit of script doctoring and also uses him to sort of as an intermediary with Richard Burton, the star, when he's being a bit difficult. And this sort of sets the tone a bit for how le Carré interacts with these adaptations. Next, please. And this seems to kind of inspire le Carré. He gets really interested in filmmaking. And his biography by Adam Seisman talks about how le Carré basically spent a large portion of the late 60s working on screenplay adaptations of his fourth novel, The Looking Glass War, and fifth novel, A Small Town in Germany. But all in vain. So The Looking Glass War was eventually produced and they just didn't use the screenplay. They didn't touch it. They used a different screenplay. And A Small Town in Germany was never filmed at all. And this seems to have sort of bruised and disillusioned le Carré a bit and put him off filmmaking. But fortunately, there was another screen media which he could write for. Sorry, it's a lot of clicking, unfortunately. So he at this point, around the turn of the 70s, he starts having a go at writing television. And he writes, rather than adapt one of his novels, he writes a television play called The End of the Line. And this is sort of a kind of le Carré-ish pastiche of Harold Pinter about sort of a nuclear scientist who's been leaking secrets, is on a railway train having a kind of breakdown, and a mysterious clergyman comes and tries to sort of get him to confess things. This was submitted to the BBC as a potential entry in their Wednesday Play series, but it was rejected. So here is a letter from Sean McLaughlin, script editor on the Wednesday Play, which he sends to le Carré's agent, Carol Smith. And he says, "Dear Carol, thank you for your hospitality. Graham MacDonald, the producer, and I have now both read The End of the Line by John le Carré and unhappily decided against producing it as a Wednesday Play. We both found it very cleverly written, and I found it interesting to me personally, but we had to agree that it would not involve the very large audience we are aimed at. You have, of course, heard these reasons frequently before, but it probably does not do any harm to spell it out to you, for you to pass on to John le Carré that we have to entertain a large audience, up to 10 million, at the same time as encouraging the best writing available. My feeling about the play is that it is something the author has been longing to do for a long time between entertaining large audiences and why not." So they're sort of lightly kind of chiding le Carré for, I think, for not really taking television seriously and kind of, seeing it as a bit of a kind of bit of flood to do between, proper novel projects. And so Carol Smith writes back and says, "Dear Sean, well, I must say I admire your courage in turning down the play by John le Carré. Certain elements, do you know who my client is? But I do understand your reasoning, and I think the point you make is very valid. John le Carré would quite like to meet you at some time for a general talk, and perhaps we could arrange this when he is a little available." So he's interested in Carré potentially doing other projects with television. Not much really happens at this juncture. The end of the line does in fact get made. Le Carré instead submits this to Thames Television, the ITV franchise holder, and it gets made as an armchair theatre production with a young Ian Holm as the clergyman. And on transmission, a review by James Thomas in the Daily Express says, "Not often does TV tempt a successful millionaire writer like John le Carré into its drama market. This was the work of a master of espionage stories in a TV world where the spy story is usually mediocre." So here's a sense that actually, you know, this reviewer at least is saying that maybe, you know, if someone like John le Carré offers you a play, you should like snap his arm off. Did the BBC regret letting this fall through their fingers? Well, according to this ITV monitoring report by Arnold Hinchliffe, not really. He describes this as, for me, the most disappointing play of the year. High hopes turned to exasperation. To hold interest was like fumbling through a football of cotton wool for a secret message the size of a sixpence. And when the message was finally reached, it was no secret at all, just a statement of what had seemed pretty obvious all the time. I thought it was interesting to talk about this because, as we will see, like just within a few years, the attitude of various TV companies to le Carré suddenly becomes way more deferential, and this quite dismissive attitude of the turn of the 70s evaporates quite quickly. So it's interesting for contrast. So le Carré then, after a bit of an attempt to sort of move into non-genre literature that doesn't work out, relaunches his series of spy novels with one of his most celebrated texts, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is published in 1974. And almost immediately, the issue of adaptation raises its head. As he later recalled, "I did incidentally receive film offers for Tinker Tailor, but I didn't feel comfortable with the idea. I was very leery then of the short form, and I thought that Tinker Tailor would work far better in the long form," this being the long form of television serial. It's much more expansive runtime. And so he found himself working with a very respected broadcasting institution, which was, of course, London Weekend Television. So Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in the mid-70s was originally developed as a potential production of LWT for ITV. But as this BBC memo later noted, the project was abandoned because the author disliked the scripts. As the Evening Standard later reported, London Weekend TV were originally going to film Tinker Tailor, but they dropped it when le Carré and then their programme controller, Cyril Bennett, were dissatisfied with the scripts. And in Adam Simon's le Carré biography, the project stalled because David did not like the scripts. As someone who's done quite a lot of digging into these kind of myths and legends surrounding Tinker Tailor, and how I've often traced them back to le Carré, I get very suspicious when everybody's kind of basically the same thing, saying the same thing, giving the same line, and not much detail. So I've always been curious about this LWT proposed adaptation, and I found it very hard to get any information about it until recently, when someone I know on Twitter under the name of YFan alerted me to the fact that this is actually written about in Rex Firkin's memoir of being, well, his memoir, which covers his time as head of drama at LWT, and he gives kind of a certain one version of what really happened here. So in his version, it was actually LWT who persuaded le Carré that the television serial would be the ideal vehicle for adapting Tinker Tailor. And he said, "Cyril and I took David Cornwell out to a series of extraordinarily expensive dinners to talk him over. With great care, we chose the writer to handle the adaptation, Julian Bond, a writer we thought was very good, who was picked partly because he had actually been at school with David Cornwell, so at least they knew each other, which we thought might help." So suddenly we've got this kind of shift to this idea that he must be sort of coaxed and sort of flattered and everything. So in their version of the story, well, in Firkin's version story, basically they were struggling with how to handle the complex flashback structure of the novel. And to try and sort of work their way through it, they just basically doodled a couple of extremely rough script drafts just to kind of experiment with the structure that were only ever supposed to be read by like 3 or 4 people in the production office. But these got accidentally leaked to le Carré himself, who hated them. And so Cornwell read both scripts and went berserk. He rang Cyril, accusing him and us of wrecking his work and ruining his reputation. We're incompetent, and so on and so on. He was beside himself with anger. Cyril was also furious and totally in agreement with him. He cancelled the whole thing, paid everything off, and gave Cornwell back the rights. So I find this kind of extraordinary. I'm not really an expert in the legal situation of having having the rights to a book, but I find it interesting that they apparently had the rights, and thus could, in theory, perhaps just have gone ahead with this, like the people who made the Looking Glass Wall film was just be like, we don't really care what you think. But by their incredible kind of admiration of him and his sort of forced personality, he's able to basically kind of force them to kind of sell the rights back to him. And despite that, there's still this kind of weird note of deference in Firkin's account. He says, perhaps I have to ask myself, we were not able to intellectually match the formidable David Cornwell and produce the result of that we wish. Slightly losing my place. Okay, so the mantle then gets taken up by the team behind the BBC Two classic serial, and under the purview of producer Jonathan Powell. And so they've been basically kind of doing the classic novel adaptation sequence in the late 1970s. These are some of the other novels that they've been doing during this period. We have Dickens, we have Hardy, we have Bronte, so on. What links most of these authors? By the fact that they were almost all dead by the late 1970s and thus couldn't interfere and cause problems. With the sole exception of Rebecca West, who I actually understand did have a kind of advisory role at the age of 85, which I'd love to dig into actually. So there is a bit of precedent for this here. And there's another interesting thing is that they attempted to do an adaptation of War's Brideshead Revisited. And of course, War was dead by this point, but even in death, the author's estate could still cause problems because apparently they spent ages kind of trying to negotiate with the War estate to get the rights list. Then the deal fell through, and the War estate gave it to Granada Television instead, who did it in 1981. So even a dead author can kind of potentially cause problems in terms of sort of rights and approving of the version you're doing. So Tinker Tailor was, long story short, Tinker Tailor was basically kind of done as a replacement project for Brideshead Revisited instead. And again, we go through this kind of story of Le Carré having to be kind of coaxed and cajoled and seduced. As the biography by Seligman said, Powell went home and changed into a suit before going to meet David. A tall man, he squatted on his haunches as he attempted to convey his enthusiasm to the story. We will do your book properly, he told David. And it was stipulated in the contract that the choice of the producer and the writer of the series were to be subject to our client's approval. In fact, David would be involved at every level of production. And this gets basically an entire chapter in the biography. So it's actually quite a sort of significant moment in Le Carré's career. I feel like a lot of what I've been doing in terms of my chapter here and so on is almost trying to read between the lines of this account, because I feel like the ellipses are often as interesting as what's there. So one of Le Carré's major moves was recruiting Alec Guinness to be the star actor. So with Powell's agreement, David had made the initial approach to Guinness. It was, of course, highly unusual for the author of a novel being adapted for the screen to take the initiative in this way. Here's an excerpt from the letter he sent to Guinness, and he tries to sort of define his role. He says, Arthur Hopcraft is to write the script and seems willing to let me look over his shoulder now and then. Jonathan Powell is the producer, knows I am writing you this letter and supports his aspiration. Otherwise, I have no responsibility in the project, which is as I would wish. But that's not entirely true, because we still continue to get the sense of him kind of hovering around. I mean, here's a photo of him hanging around with Alec Guinness out on location. Another notable contribution he does is, well, as Seisman says, David helped the series designer Austin Spriggs to ensure that everything looked as it should. He described files, code books, one-time encryption pads, and the other paraphernalia of spying, so that Spriggs could depict these realistically. And here I've got a transcript of a conversation between Le Carré and Austin Spriggs, which they just go into exhaustive detail about the kind of the backstory of the characters, how this might influence the design work. I did actually interview Jonathan Powell about a decade ago, and I did ask him about this. And he talked a bit, he made the good point that they were trying to depict the intelligence world accurately, Le Carré had worked in MI5 and MI6. So, you know, at least on that level, you know, it would be silly not to kind of take advantage of his knowledge in terms of this accurate representation. But as I've said, Le Carré gets no credit. His only appearance in the credits is the possessive John Le Carré, as in the source novel author. He is not credited as advisor, not as consultant, not as executive producer, nothing like that. But at the same time, it wasn't really a secret that he'd been involved. There are interviews with him from transmission time in 1979, where he openly kind of talks about his active involvement. I've got a couple of quotes here that I'm a little bit self-conscious here because I'm given the focus of this conference and the focus of this panel, I am of course quoting the powerful. So I'm not saying we have to take these people's word for it. But certainly Powell said that this was one of those things that went brilliantly from start to finish. And Le Carré said this was something where director, cast and crew came genuinely to relish what they were making, where the inevitable squabbles and rivalries gave way to a larger shared purpose. So again, he's kind of assuming the ability to speak for a large range of people here. The main reason I put these quotes up is just to kind of draw, because basically these people would not say the same thing about the next time they worked together, which was a little less harmonious. So whilst they were making Eating Potato Soldier Spy, Le Carré was writing another novel, essentially a sequel called Smiley's People. And the initial thought was actually that that Le Carré and Guinness in collaboration would go on to do an adaptation of Smiley's People. But they actually thought about just kind of ditching the BBC and running away and making a film together. So something which would inevitably be read as a follow-up, but getting rid of Powell and the BBC team. So by June 1979, more than 6 months before it was published, David's representatives had already received 2 offers for film rights in the new book. It was taken as self-evident that Guinness would play the part in any feature film. And according to Seisman, it was actually Guinness who said, no, I'd rather do this with the BBC, actually. Let's stick where we are after considering this. And Smiley's People was turned out to be a more troublesome production. So as Powell told me, it was more troublesome. It didn't go quite as smoothly as the first one. Firstly, they originally had John Mackenzie on board to direct it. John Mackenzie was the director of The Long Good Friday, which was sort of in kind of not able to be released hell during this time. But he was dismissed. And as Alec Guinness said in a letter to his friend Anne Kaufman, the director has been fired as incompatible. I quite liked him in his raw way, but he and the producer got to non-speakers and he and Le Carré to sniping. The atmosphere was bad and boded ill for future work. So I threw in my vote when requested with producer and Le Carré's. Interesting. I mean, obviously there's the conflict with the producer, but it does seem like the conflict with Le Carré, who again is not on the production team, it still ends up being quite decisive. He's clearly, Le Carré is sort of involved enough that it's considered not practical to have a director who disagrees. But the more serious issue, another serious issue is with the writing. So I remember when I first watched Smiley's People, and this credit comes up here. It says screenplay John Le Carré, and I thought, so Le Carré wrote this one, unlike Tinker Tailor. And then, sort of as I watched, the credit transforms into screenplay John Hopkins because the John is basically in the same place. I was like, am I hallucinating this? But no, it turns out this was a screenplay in which both John Hopkins, a writer responsible for things like Talking to a Stranger, had originally worked, and then Le Carré did another draft, and this seems to have been the source of some conflict. So as Seisman writes, John Hopkins produced a script which was thought much too long and wrong in various other ways. By this time, the cast had been assembled and the BBC was ready to start shooting. So David was obliged to rewrite the script himself very quickly with help from Jane, his wife, and input from Guinness. Or as Alec Guinness puts it, the scripts were for the most part no good, and Le Carré is tidying at them between ski runs in Swiss, the millionaire author glamour. There seems to have been enormous kind of, so I've had a look in the BBC written archives about this. They've recently declassified the Smiley's People papers. I had hoped to talk about them at this conference, but I ran out of time because the papers are enormous. There seems to be a hugely sort of protracted struggle between Le Carré and Hopkins and their representatives over who contributed what to the screenplay. And the fact that there was even kind of delicate negotiations, the fact that their names do not appear on screen at the same time, this really quite strange formatting of the credits. So I'm looking forward to digging into that at some point and find out what really went down. So I've just got one last slide here, in which case I just want to kind of bring it forward to the present and the more recent Carré adaptations, which are The Night Manager from 2016 and The Little Drummer Girl from 2018, where Le Carré is now credited as executive producer amongst various other people. And of course, this is part of what seems to be an extraordinary kind of proliferation of executive producer credits in this sort of age of kind of globalization and international co-production. The Night Manager has 10 executive producers, for example, which also includes the writer, the director, and 2 leading actors. But nonetheless, this does seem to kind of, I suspect, formalize what was sort of unwritten back in the days of Tailor and Smiley's people, and attempt to sort of give this right to be consulted and to comment a more constitutional basis. Thank you very much.
Great, really well observed. Just like really, like as a sort of production research, brilliant. I would really like to cite it in my PhD because it's relevant to me, and it kind of reveals some things in my PhD thinking, so it's really useful. Interestingly as well, I feel like you set up a binary of production is like a randomized space, editing is a maximal space. Of course, I can be the person to be like, oh, what about trans people? But what was interesting about that binary for me was that in my own research, speaking to trans people who work in production, interestingly, I spoke to a lot of trans masked people who work in editing. So they're comfortable in a masculinized space, and then leaving that space and perhaps going to production meetings or going to staff for whatever reason, that's when they encounter transphobia. So it kind of reinforces that value that it's like, oh, I was just really fascinated by that. So like, any thoughts about like the position of the trans person in this? I know. Neil, did you speak to any trans people?
I'd just say in your description of that, do you mean editorial or editing? So the words have different meanings. They're quite slippery. So editing is a relatively safe space because you tend to be in a suite to the office. Well, no, you're not in an office. You're in an edit suite, so you have more limited contact with people. But whereas editorial tends to be a lot more gladiatorial, it's a lot more arguing, and production is the kind of management space where everyone together is called a production team. So it's the terms themselves are quite tricky. The trans people I've encountered in television, I have interviewed them about their specific experiences. So I can't speak about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite, it is binary. And I think that's kind of partly where the research is that, how do we dissolve that? And the binary exists very much in terms of pay structures, working hours, which basically force anyone who is a caregiver really to have to leave. So in terms of the experience, I mean, I'm saying as Rowan, I haven't kind of interviewed anyone specifically about their experience as a trans person. But I think what is evident is there's quite a lot of work to do in supporting the kind of the working lives of anybody who doesn't fit the kind of at the moment the way of working which is supported in terms of success, pay, promotion. There's still a lot of work to do, and certainly there's been quite a few bits of research that come out in the last couple of years that show that's not massively changed. There is a lot of work that's being done around. There's a lot of discussion which is happening, a lot of it to do with the work Rowan's done, which is really hopeful. There's some green shoots of hope about, and I think COVID played its part in how, production, when I was doing my research on production managers even a few years ago, pre-COVID, a lot of production managers were really not very interested in the idea of job shares. They felt it could be done, and then actually they had to completely revisit that. That said, there's still a lot of that kind of perspective of, and there's a couple of really good social media accounts to follow, which kind of have people sharing their experiences right now in production, and there's still this idea that you've got to just work the hours you want. If you're asked to do a contract and you can't even do one day of that contract because maybe you've got a wedding to go to or your own child's christening, you won't get the contract. The working model still very much favours what I would term a masculine approach to work-life balance, because we know that women statistically are doing, or people who identify as women are doing more caregiving, looking after children, and that has the impact. It would be really interesting to get the view of trans production managers, but that's certainly not something. I think, given what we already know, I would imagine that there's definitely there's probably work to be done there as well.
It's kind of like that structural thing. It's not that.
It is a structural thing, yeah.
Like appointments or something to go to. Like,
Well, can I just add as well? So Anna Bryan's done theorising the production space as masculine. Ross, this is a thought that's never occurred to me before. I went from production management to editorial, so transitioned that way and experienced quite a lot of hostility from both sides as you cross that divide. And I mean, I don't know if that's a useful perspective for the work that you're doing. So never thought of it in that framework before. But for people doing that transition within, we all experience this sort of weirdness of not being quite at one with the space. And it could be additional work to convince people of your validity. It was very present for everyone who generally went from production management to editorial. And it did tend to be women who made that jump, because women tended to be encouraged to go into production management. And then because I ended up in the department of BBC, there was soup that I entered the arts and I had educational background. I was able to make the transition because I was so quite qualified. So there's the additional work.
Where do you see like the editing space in the analysis? Or are you just so focused on production management?
Well, my PhD was on it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So where does it kind of feature in the bio then as well?
I don't know. I mean, I want to consider. I'd love to talk to you more about it. I've never thought about it in that frame. But it's definitely a space of. I often refer to it as a confessional.
Yeah. I mean, it is very much its own habitat.
Yeah.
We think about. I was talking about, the quote I used about little crystallised spaces. I mean, my partner's an editor. I spent many years of my life sitting in edit suite, and there is an intimacy that's created when he's sat in an edit suite. I would say that in my experience, and this may be different now, the majority of editors were male. But also there was a very slight disconnect, because they're often they're receiving stuff, but then they're working with editorial. But it would be a space where people could come and kind of vent, they could talk.
The secrets.
It's where all the secrets were kept. So yeah, I mean, that's probably a very interesting thing to do some research on as well. But from a production management point of view, you're very much looking at edit because you're going to the final push. And you just really need to be kind of keeping your eye on. And it's often that's where we start to run into the problems, because the fish rots from the head. So you'd have an edit, it'd be looking great, and then the series producer or someone would walk in, and then they'd want lots of changes. And then you're looking at your timelines slipping. So there's a bit of tension within that space as well. So I don't think particularly answered your question, but just gives you a little bit of an idea.
Thank you. Great. Bianca was next, and then Krista later. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the speakers. It was absolutely interesting. It made me, your papers really make me think a lot about problems, issues of visibility of these speakers. That's so important, and for the development and for the achievement of the final product. I was wondering, what is TV? And this is a question open to all of you. What is TV doing in terms of representation and visibility of these outside figures? And of course, I was thinking about during your paper, Luca, I was thinking, of course, about the lovely cult TV series that we have in Italy, like Boris, but also some recently imported adaptations of French formats like For My Agent. And so I was wondering how is TV doing in terms of representation of these figures, and what can be done or what should be done, because it can be, of course, detrimental in terms of, you know, perpetuating stereotypes or focusing on, you know, it's just sides of the work, the whole, you know, the complexity of what's implied in an agent activity, for example, because of course there are actors agents, but also makeup artists agents, and you know, different. And you mentioned that I was absolutely interested in that side. So, or is it being useful, or so what's going on? What's your impression, basically? I'm curious about what you think, and what can be done. What can you know, suggest? Yeah, thank you.
First, I'm happy to pick that one up. There's some really good work being done, and you know, the important thing is to not come away from these kind of round tables thinking, oh my God, working in television production is so hideous. There's some really interesting stuff being done. ITV have got a whole department based around diversity. I've worked a lot with Sam Tatlow, who's one of the, she's a woman who's working there, and they're actually putting a lot of money into commissioning scripts for people from marginalised communities, making sure that there's kind of true diversity, both in front of the camera, but also importantly behind. I mean, obviously we always have to approach these kind of initiatives. The BBC are doing kind of similar work. We have to, it not to be, you know, scepticism doesn't always get us everywhere. We don't want it to be ultra cynical, but we always have to approach these with this. And is there any tokenism going on here? But also we have to look that within that tokenism, good can also happen. So we need to be careful that we don't just end up being so cynical that it's like, well, what's the point? So there's definitely some good stuff happening. There's been some really interesting reports that have been done, I think, over the last kind of 5 years. Some work that Rowan's done, particularly, which is, you know, really highlighted. Beck2 have also done some great work. And these have not been reports that have just kind of been swept under the carpet. They've been widely shared. And there are new conversations happening about people's like work conditions. There is still a lot to be done, but we are starting to look at production. My own PhD is actually looking at this kind of stuff. We're looking at production in different ways to see, you know, why is the 12-hour day the 12-hour day? Do we need that? The big problem is always money, because budgets are kind of squeezing, they're wanting more and more, and that's always going to be a pressure. But there is definitely work that's being done. I mean, there's some policy. Obviously there was the 5-year Ofcom review a couple of years ago, which gave a number of recommendations. And again, while that data's not, you know, exhaustive, it gave an idea of where good things were happening and where we could kind of move in forward in that. So yeah, I think there's definitely work that's being done. I think some of it has to come from policy, but some of it's going to come from indies who are taking their own initiatives about the way they want the production world to be.
Hand over to Luca.
Thank you very much for the question. That's very interesting. I would answer you in two different ways. One first way is the fact that with this kind of figures, we have discussed that on talent managers, but we can tell the same stuff about commissioners in television industry, about casting directors, about a lot of other figures we are investigating inside the projects. You are good at your work when you stay invisible. The moment you are visible, it's because you've done a mistake or something went wrong. You know, in a way, it's part of the job to because general audience is kind of has this kind of romantic idea of the author, and so also academia for decades has had it. Now we are, of course, understanding way better, thanks to production studies, media industry studies and stuff like that, how much complex and contradictory this auto-reality is. But if we are talking about the mass audience towards which TV series are talked about, this kind of invisibility is still a value. Of course, you have the titles, you discuss the titles, there's they have discussed longly in the interviews every single details about the titles and where to put the names and stuff like that. But that's the kind of visibility and recognition for the actors and for the intermediary figures as well. So I have this idea that at one point, the more are you invisible, the better your work is going, and you will be called on other projects and stuff like that. Of course, the industry people are well aware that's not an actual invisibility. It's just the other part of the answer is that it's been increasingly told how the television industry works. You were right in that comment as well. So meta-reflexivity has been a staple of television everywhere in the world since the very beginning. But in the last decades, probably the complexity quality factor has kind of allowed for a recognition of the work. And you mentioned two series. One is probably only for Italians, which is Boris. It was 15 years ago, more or less, and the representation, ironic, parodic, very funny actually, of a film then becoming television set. And then there is Call My Agent, the Poussin, the French series, which has been adapted in several places, as including Italy. We actually also interviewed people involved in that production in order for our project, and I think it's very telling to see how in 15 years in Italy the representation has changed from parody to homage in a way. And so kind of before it was, okay, television is trash, they are just working trashily to do trashy outcomes. And it was not true at the time, but it was working as a general discourse. And of course it's funny, and it's something you need to take into account as well. Now it's different. Now producing television series is something comparable to the golden years of the cinema industry. And so the representation changes, and the castings are the main characters, are the agents, are the people in charge, are complex characters, of course, funny as well, but also very serious one. And so the representation of this kind of intermediary figures has become less parodic and a bit more sticky to the real. Of course, it's entertainment.
Great, thank you. Do you want to respond?
I think I might defer. I'm no kind of expert on contemporary production.
Great. Krista, it's you next.
Just right, done it. Hi. Yeah, I thank you first of all to all of the speakers. Absolutely fascinating. And Luca, I don't have any questions for you, but I really enjoyed that. I'd read that book. That was just great. But my actual well, question, more of a comment for Rowan and Perelandra about this sort of sense of things have changed and why have they changed in this way. And I think there is a perception, colleagues of mine who were working in indies in the 90s, there is a perception that the change around the role of production manager was not necessarily accidental, partly obviously an outcome of, possibly of producer's choice, as you discussed. But there's also a factor in the indies where it was seen sometimes as a good way of managing costs, and specifically that that division between editorial and production was seen as a good way of managing costs. Because obviously, if you've got somebody who's very much part of the crew, very much invested in the project, that's very different from somebody who's kept a little separate, a little aloof. It's like our finance departments, right? The people who tell you can't do stuff because they haven't got an engagement or even understanding what you're trying to do. So the idea of there being a sort of separate person over there who was going to say no to money and was going to drive costs down was, for some indies at least, quite a deliberate action, in much the same way as employing edit producers, which in one stroke sort of removes any sense of authorship that a producer might have, because suddenly they've put together the makings of a program, and then it's taken out their hands and somebody else entirely is going to be in charge of stitching it together into something, which suddenly gives the commissioner a lot more power in the whole scenario, because they're actually the only consistent person. So one can be quite cynical and say part of this, at least, is because it's convenient for owners. I think that was my comment or thought or whatever.
Yeah. I think you're quite right. I mean, I know certainly probably around 5 years ago, maybe more, I know the BBC very much changed the progression structure there to kind of discourage production. And yeah, you're nodding your head there, Chris. To kind of discourage sideways moves by production staff. So they very much kept on the trajectory of production coordinator, production manager, and in a way that was, I spoke to people, colleagues who were still there, and it kind of made the role smaller, because it was like very much stay in your own lane. And that was something that was implemented by HR. And suddenly, whereas before, you could apply for jobs within the BBC, working in editorial, working across, making that move. Whilst people still did it, particularly in Indies, but particularly at the BBC, the idea was very much, it's a clear route, stay in your lane. And obviously, yeah, that in some ways, it serves an idea of what production management does and does not do. So I think that's a really interesting and accurate observation. So thank you for that. Have you got anything to add to that, Rowan?
Yeah, I was just thinking about genre as well. So the PM that quote came from when she was talking about this kind of relatively free period in her career. She was primarily working on sitcoms, and she actually goes on to sort of demarcate quite clearly that when her job changed. It was when she moved on to a really big drama, and the finances for the drama were controlled from London, and the drama was being filmed in Yorkshire. So there was no, there were far fewer set visits. There was far less kind of, there was a porous nature, but also you've, I think, described quite well, of people going from set to the office and being able to travel quite freely was stopped. And also on the note of edit producers, that role really developed with reality TV and the volume of footage that had to be dealt with. So it's both a response to this kind of the specificity of the genre, but also a way of controlling the money and controlling both creativity and money in two realms. So yeah, I don't know what came first, but it's not been good.
No, it's become a kind of a cage.
Yeah.
The production managers have kind of ended up within, and it wasn't always the way. People will say, well, that's always been the way it's been for production managers, but I think as the research shows, no, it certainly hasn't, and it isn't actually that way everywhere. So it's very successful production managers, and I know through my research, and Rowan's found the same, that you'll speak to some production managers who have a completely different experience. They feel it's very collegiate, they're very involved, but more and more we're seeing this kind of like a funneling of the role, really.
Do we have other questions?
We have time?
Yes, we have.
I had a question for the Lucas, or Luca and Luca. What would be a television show title? For the Lucas, either way. You made a really interesting point when looking at it from an intermediary's point of view, how the film and television distinction become increasingly blurred. I thought it was really interesting you were saying that more important distinctions were legacy media versus online native platforms, And was the other distinction entertainment and like YouTubers and TikTok artists?
Yeah, the other distinction was kind of the definition they gave us in the interview is in one interview actually is the one that's used by the European Union actually, audiovisual oeuvre.
Right. Okay.
So audiovisual oeuvre versus entertainment. So I would say that that the first distinction is more of a functional one. Distinguishing legacy media and digital platforms is in the way they are operating. With legacy media, talent agents have more room for negotiation. With digital platforms, they have way less room. There's a standardization. It's slightly changing already, but at the very beginning, with the entrance of Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime Video in the production in Italy, at the very beginning, they were very much kind of impositive in their ways without taking into account the traditions that happened along the previous decades in the Italian system. And so they told us I had not the time to explore that more in detail. For instance, about the self-dubbing clause. The fact that increasingly in Italy productions are made in English language, but the actors have the rights in their contracts to self-dub themselves in Italian language. And this is something that was questioned by the digital platforms. We are not giving you that right. We are choosing the voice that looks for us best. And at the first moment, it was a reason to fight. And then they kind of smoothened a bit. So this is what I mean is operational. Digital platforms are coming way more structured. The source of power is far away and unreachable and so on. So several layers of intermediations, and then change the practices and the details and the ways they are used. Sometimes for the best, sometimes in the industrialization mode, and often for the worst as well. The other distinction is more of a creative one. Distinguishing audiovisual oeuvres and entertainment management. Some agents are already, not many of our interviews, working on both fields. So also thinking about their actors going to television shows or managing their YouTube accounts or stuff like that. But at the moment, it's still mainly distinguished and interviewing also a lot of actors. We have done that already also in the research, kind of a peer of younger actors and already another fight approaching between younger actors trained as actors, self-defining as actors, and other kinds of performers, influencers, YouTubers, TikTokers, and stuff like that, that in some television productions, in some digital productions, are already picked instead of actors because of their followers, because of their recognition, which is better, but so it's still a place where we need to do more investigation, but we are already seeing the first steps of the future fight, which is a creative one. Where is the border between being an actor, managed as an actor, or are actors, of course, or being an influencer, managing or self-managing, often with talent agencies as well, as an influence. And so we'll see.
Luca, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just to add a point on the first point Luca made. There's also an impact, it seems, on the star system. So Netflix is increasingly using its brand to publicize, to market the product, and to marginalize a little bit the names of the stars and even the images of the stars. This, of course, is important because it gives you a little bit more power if you impose this model when you negotiate cachet and the other sort of contractual terms, because you're less reliable from the actors and the cast, and then you can market your products with, such as like the Netflix series, And of course, you own the brand, you own the Nexus brand. So it's much easier to, in terms of negotiation, they can exercise much more power and say, okay, you don't get the star. Well, we move to the next one because what counts is actually our brand rather than the face of a given actor or the name of a given director. I'm not saying that it's going to be like this in the near future. I'm just saying that agent told us that Netflix in particular is pushing towards that direction.
Very interesting. Thank you.
We've run out of time and there's a pizza truck waiting for us outside. So I think we have to say thank you so much to the presenters. I really hope you get a pizza as well.
It will be easier.
I just have to say, I was going to comment about this. It was so interesting seeing the to and froing, and I liked the quote. As someone who has worked on adaptations to very well-known authors,